Like, let's say I one day have kids and my son comes home and tells me that he has a different interpretation of something in the Bible than I do. I don't know if I could tell him he's wrong.
So kind of taking that now to the church, I think we look at the term unity and what we think is uniformity, which those are two very different things. And I think that's where a lot of the problem comes in, because we can't unify around things that we disagree on when we should be able to, as long as they're not core. Like if you believe Jesus is God, if you believe that he died for us, then that's core faith. But on the other issues, you should be able to unify within the same church body around having a difference opinion of whether or not women can speak, around having a difference of opinion on whether or not we baptize by dunking or the spritzing water. Like those things.
Pretty given passages, poetry or history.
Yeah, exactly. So those different things. And yeah, we should be able to unify around them, but often churches don't, because what they have in their mind for unity is uniformity, which is not the same thing. And it's not what I would argue, it's not what Christ stood for. He stood for unity of the church, not uniformity.
Why do you think there is this big push towards uniformity? Because it doesn't occur to me that this is an inherently, like, if you were making a church, this isn't something you'd put on your list of things you really want to have.
Mm-hmm.
So, like,
That's a
what
good point.
forces do you think promote that?
I think that comes down to a little bit of historical context, and the fact that for so many years the church was used to keep people in line, and that allegiance to the king or queen. And I don't think it's now conscious. I think it's something that kind of in the church's DNA has been passed on, so to speak, and we've just never fully addressed it. Or maybe it's just that we don't know how to address it as well, because I wouldn't know where to start with that. But I think it comes down to that generational. It's been passed down. Not that the church physically has DNA, but like it's been passed down through the structures and the, like, I would say, argue, like the church's spiritual DNA, that we've kind of grabbed onto these ideas and are sticking with them, even though they may not make the most sense anymore.
Because it occurs to me, like, I don't even know how I would do that. Like, let's say I one day have kids and my son comes home and tells me that he has a different interpretation of something in the Bible than I do. I don't know if I could tell him he's wrong. Like, I don't know if I could prove that, or like, oh, so why do you think that? That's interesting. I always thought it was this way. Like, what brings somebody to be like, oh, my reaction should be to get my interpretation into them?
Yeah, and I think part of it.
There, like, is it because, like, maybe at one point in my life it was really useful for me to have my interpretation, and so I want them to have my interpretation?
Well, I think part of it too is kind of like with the Protestant Reformation, and that when Protestants broke off from the Catholic Church, there was a lot of pressure to get it right and not mess up again. And I think what's happened is we just keep fragmenting down and down, further and further, because everyone's trying to get it 100% fully right. But I think it was John Wesley who said, like, we're not going to be 100% accurate in our faith, but the goal is to be 100% accurate, or try and be what we think is 100% accurate in each area. But we know that we're wrong about something somewhere along the lines. Like, our faith is
English Bibles. Well, what do you want?
yeah.
Like, we're not going to be perfect in anything, even if our interpretations of our words are perfect. The translation is probably faulty in some spot.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
missing, not quite capturing the language of the original translation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and especially, like, there are some words in Greek and Hebrew that cannot be translated to
Exactly.
English directly. Like, and you really lose out on some of the enrichment there. So unless you're going to teach yourself how to speak, or how to read Greek and
And even
Hebrew.
then, you're not going to learn how to read Greek in the context that this was originally written.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe these words have slightly different connotations. Maybe whatever fish they're talking about in some paragraph was bad in some years when this was written, and so this actually means it's bad fish. Like there's so many nuances that we're just trying to be perfect. I mean, try, but
Mhm.
expect to fall short.
But yeah, and I think we also need to have a level of acceptance that we're not ever going to get there. We're not going to have that 100%, and that it comes down to humility, I think, um, and acceptance of our own. Like, we're supposed to emulate Jesus, not be Jesus, and I think that makes a difference. And like, obviously, we're trying to grow and become more like him, but I don't think to expect to ever be him. Um, like, we're going to be wrong about something.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. It's our human flaw.
Do you think it's just like a big push towards having the perfect interpretation and having everything right, and that's why people are so opposed to the introductions of these sort of new interpretations or new ideas when they do come up?
I think it's a mix of things. I don't think people ever do things for one reason, right? Like, we're humans, we're complex. So I
Yeah,
think that's part of it, but I also think it's that we also have a fear of anything new. Um, and I think too, they often feel like you're trying to change the word of God, which is not what you're doing. You're trying to um, interpret as it would have been interpreted in the day, but we're so far removed that it's hard to do that.
yeah.
Um,
Seems to me like this whole never change a word that my father wrote sort of spirit that I sometimes see in the Bible, or in the church community, not the Bible. Um, like my grandpa thought it was this way, therefore it's this way, and no arguments. It seems to me just to be like a really conservative move to never get anything wrong ever. If we
mhm,
just never adapt anything, then we'll be close to whatever my grandpa said, anyways, and he was happy with it.
yeah, and
And that has less risk, and yeah, there's a total failure to assess the risk of being this amorphous body because that's not what.
mhm.
Oh, sorry, yeah, amorphous body because that's never what we were meant to be.
And I
And
think too, where you also see that come into play is when, like, missionary work, because oftentimes the gospel is it fits into any context, but the problem is that we've westernized it so much that often now when missionaries go over, they're also taking is Western culture with them. They're not just taking the gospel in and of itself. And I think we get really caught up on our version of it. um, and it allows us to kind of hide from where we might be wrong. If everybody believes that same thing, then our interpretation is right and we don't have to change anything. Um, so yeah, I think it comes down to like having the humility to embrace other cultures and have the dialogue with them too, so they can point out our blind spots, because everybody has blind spots. And I think with the church wanting uniformity, it allows them to ignore blind spots. And not have to deal with those blind spots, because they can be hard to deal with when they come up. And when you realize that you've had a blind spot, like, sometimes you really have to reshape things or reshape the way you're thinking, and it's uncomfortable. So being able to have that uniformity allows you to never have to face those things that you don't want to face because they're a little bit uncomfortable and difficult to deal with.
yeah, it really is just missing the ongoing risk of not changing, though. There's
Mm-hmm.
also risk to picking a university when you're graduating from high school.
Yeah.
You might be going to a bad school, you might be going to a good school, but if you never choose to go to a school, you're losing out as well.
Yeah.
Like you can't just choose to never move forward because eventually time will keep moving.
Yeah.
And similarly, like we can choose whether or not it's good or bad. We can choose not to ever change or make a decision on if it's okay to interpret a passage this way or if it's okay to reinterpret something for this culture. But if we don't, then we're just going to keep shrinking. And that's also a risk. And geez, if you don't value
Mm-hmm.
that at the same level as you value maybe getting something a little bit wrong for a bit, you know, then you really don't see the whole picture of the risk, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that, especially like with all these numbers I've been hearing about in Western cultures about the decline of Christianity, it's that has to be more important than calling God they or he.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and again, like kind of along the same lines, I think it comes back to the heart of it, right? Like what is, rather than trying to get everything right, what is the unchangeable? And like identifying that. And to me, that's the two most central ones would be Jesus is God and he died for us, and everything else kind of falls around that. But like if you put everything has that core, there's never going to be any um, I don't think it's necessarily healthy, and I think there's never growth. There's never you're trying to get everything right instead of working through it. And
I mean, if you're trying to talk about like all these uh, parables or whatever with a new village, you're trying to like some missionaries have gone to a fishing village, for example. There's a lot of farming language that might need to be reinterpreted for them.
yeah,
If you don't, a lot less people are going to find God. What is the
yeah,
great risk here? Is that you might not do the farming parable quite as well as you do the fishing one, or that people won't hear the word of God. Like, come on, do some
mhm.
relative risk calculations here.
Yeah. I was reading in high school about this suggestion that because a lot of missionaries go over and they're like, well, Jesus is the bread of life, or there's that imagery. Well, when you're in Asian cultures, it should actually be like the rice of life, because they don't do bread. Like that's not something. Well, they have bread now but like
But even then, I'm sure
they know.
culturally it feels kind of other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The food that their families have been sustained on for a lot longer is rice. So it
Hmm.
makes sense. This is the and if even if you try to put it back into the context of um uh like the this is the bread, that this is my body, like this is what people will feed on for many generations, and this is the like man, that speaks way better than just making sure it's bread,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
Like even there, talk about your relative risk. Like you can't underweigh the risk of never changing anything.
Hmm.
It's choosing to never go to school, to never take that risky job. The risk in not doing things is enormous, and humans are so good at ignoring the risk of not doing things.
Yeah, yeah.
Outside of faith and everything.
And it's like the idea of sins of omission, which is not what you did wrong, but what you didn't do that you could have done,
Yeah,
and you chose not to. And I think that the
those are
totally.
just easy to ignore.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
why it's lasted this long. That's why we're having this. At least part of why we're having this big decline in faith in Western societies.
Hmm.
I think it's an easy, you know, it's an easy thing on the individual level to write. On an institutional level, obviously, everything.
Yeah.
A big boat moves slow, turns slowly.
But if everybody starts from the ground, like movements always start ground up, right?
I
And
mean, like especially Christianity must be the perfect example, right?
mm, so yeah. But this has been a very enriching conversation. But
Awesome.
I do have a meeting that I should head to.
Oh,
Um, but
a couple hours later now. All right.
thank you for listening, everybody. We appreciate it. Hope that you got something out of this, and we will see you again soon.